Hi everyone, welcome back to Looplive. My name's Josh Gallagher, MediaCom's Chief Product Officer for Asia Pacific. And you're on Looplive, our weekly or bi-weekly content series that gives a little bit of an inside look into some of marketing and media's biggest challenges. And today we're going to talk about something that's rising up the ranks, and that's influencer. We've been talking about influencers for a long period of time. But now I think is the tipping point where we're getting a big bit of scale out of influencer and influencer content. We've got some good examples of big brands now using influencers and being influenced by influencer culture in their mainstream communications. Coke recently came out with their Real Magic campaign that used gamers and esports influencers as the real centerpiece of their global brand platform. And that changes everything when we start to think about how we use influencers, not just to change the way people purchase things or to gain a little bit of engagement on a social platform, but how it's infiltrating popular culture and big brands. So today we're going to talk about the impact of influencers, but also how brands can make an impact with influencers. For me, it's really interesting because the shape of influencers is also expanding. It's not just, as I said, about creating a bit of engagement on a social platform. We're seeing social commerce being overtaken by things like live commerce and influencers in that space. But on the other hand, with Coke, we're seeing it as part of big awareness campaigns that make a real difference to the way brands communicate. And we're seeing results as well, right? Influencer content now holds attention. There's a lot of discussion around not just reach, but attention. 44% of people pay more attention and hold the attention of an ad if it has an influencer on it. And it makes a big difference at point of purchase. On social media, those ads that have influencers in them get 90% more action than the ones that don't. So today we're going to talk about how to scale influencers, when's the right time and how best to do it. So I'm going to introduce two people to be able to do that today. I'm going to introduce Arthur and Joyce from our teams at MediaCom and Inca to take us through their expertise in influencers. So over to you guys.
Hello everyone, thanks Josh for the intro. I'm delighted to be here. So we'll be sharing my screen because we have a few slides to show for today.
Hi, everyone. Well, Arthur is sharing his screen. Just a little bit of quick intro. I'm Joyce, and I do communications planning out of the Singapore office for the region in APAC. And Arthur, a little bit more about yourself.
Yes, I'm Arthur Altunian, based in Singapore, and I'm the Inca lead for APAC, and I look after the client's development as well in the region.
Cool. So I think Josh has already, had a little bit of a spoiler for some of the data points that we see on the screen right now. It's a really interesting sort of like a point in time for us as well, Arthur. We have obviously been talking about influencers for a long time and for a while now. What is this new news, and why do we think that influencers are still, if not even more relevant today, in your opinion?
I think it's quite important, maybe one step back in terms of defining what we mean by influencers marketing. In principle, it's not something new because brands have been collaborating with ambassadors, celebrities, or individuals for as long as I can remember. And I think influencers marketing is a relationship between a brand, an advertiser, and an individual who is called influencers, talent, creators, and in some part of the world, KOL, key opinion leaders. And these influencers endorse and promote the product or the service for the brand. And they do that on their social media channels. So the Instagram, the YouTube, the Facebook, the TikTok, for example, in the West. And the audiences of those are quite expecting influencers to share and being knowledgeable about a specific topic. So the main difference here is compared to traditional media or traditional advertising is you as a consumer proactively decide to follow an influencer, someone, an individual, and hence that's why you're much more receptive to the content that these individuals will share. And we can see the stats on the slide here that, of course, because you're giving consent, you obviously in a way are more receptive to the content and you pay much more attention as well. And from a brand perspective as well, what we are seeing is when I go back to the metrics in terms of return on ad spend, on average, compared to standard social campaigns, influencers marketing usually drives 6 to 11 times higher ROAS. And obviously, these numbers vary hugely per market, per verticals. But it is definitely an important channel for every single brand to consider. And that's what we've seen over the last couple of years as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one example that Josh gave was, of course, for Coke with Real Magic. But increasingly, I think this is a similar sentiment that we see in a lot of the brands and clients that we work with. It is one of the fastest growing strategies for brands, not just, I think when it comes to the upper funnel work or the mid funnel work, which influencers are typically, better known for, but we're also increasingly seeing from the briefs, how is it that we can engage with influencers and creators full funnel. And when I look at, the kind of spends and the increase globally in spends, where we are projecting about 15 billion at the end of next year, these numbers are staggering. And similarly, I think in Southeast Asia we're seeing these huge growth. Any sort of like under the hood details on these numbers, Arthur?
Yes, and I think it's still a blurry line between social media and influencer spend. And that's why I think the industry is making progress in categorizing those two. But according to multiple sources, the industry should be worth around the $80 billion by 2030. And we've definitely seen a strong acceleration over the last 2 years, mainly driven by the pandemic. And that has also been driven by the social commerce and the e-commerce rise as well. And that's also very true in this part of the world, in Southeast Asia, but also in China, which is a much more mature market in that space. Something else as well to mention is, is kind of like, well, the majority of the brands who are active in these channels are the beauty, the fashions, and the retail. What we've seen more and more is different type and different verticals or different categories of brands trying and experimenting these channels. So we do have a lot of clients, for example, in FMCGs, in energies, in banking and insurance, for example. So it's kind of like a very exciting space where lots of brands are trying, experimenting, and scoping the way or how best to work with influencers and what influencers could bring to them. And if I move, of course, that's about some of the challenges that you may want to talk to us about.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've seen this kind of like rise in the spends. We've seen also, I think, the entire of the influencer and the social landscape become a lot more dynamic. The reality is that when we looked at the data, 2 in 3 marketers still feel that it is quite challenging to find what the right talent or influencer is and the right strategy to work with that. And 1 in 2 of them actually feel that, as increasingly we are exposed to so many influencers, how do you get authenticity out of what presumably might be unauthentic engagement in this new space? Any thoughts on that, Arthur?
Sure, and I think relevancy and in any type of relationship is very important. You want to make sure as an advertiser that you are collaborating with the right ones. And for those who follow a bit this space, you can see one of the latest development with Rolls-Royce in China about maybe a mismatch of influencers promoting the brand. I'm not going to spoil it and I will let you find out. But I think relevancy, helping the brands through collaborating and identifying the relevant influencers that are not only brand safe, but also perfectly fit with the brand equity. It's very important as well. We have an example, for example, where we do work with an FMCG product promoting hair care product, and their main audience is targeting women between 20 and 35. And what we did with this client is kind of like get a bit deeper in the data, and let's not just look at the face value of the influencers that they work with, but go beyond and get the data. And what we notice is, while the influencers match perfectly the brand audiences, what we saw is like actually the majority of the followers of those influencers were not female, and were not even a significant portion of them were not even located in the relevant market, on the targeted market. So it's a very simple examples where you can quite easily go deeper in the data and make sure that when you're collaborating with an influencers, on top of the brand safety and the due diligence that you will do, the followers of those influencers are also fully aligned with your audiences. So those are the things that we do help brands to, obviously, when we work on media plans, to put the right influencers on the plan. And I just want to touch base as well about the different terminologies that we have in this space. And you will hear different tiering, the big influencers on the left and the smaller one. And when I say smaller one, it's often categorized by the number of followers across all the social media platforms that they have. It's quite important to say that over 80% of the influencers in APAC are either nano and micro, so on the right side of the screen here. And what is really important for brand is to find the right balance between the reach and the authenticity and advocacy. And some of the top consideration is about the reach. If you collaborate with celebrities or influencers who have a high number of followers, you significantly increase your reach, as opposed to working with smaller tiers of influencers. What you will prioritize on that one is to driving the engagement and the conversation, and that's why we see a higher engagement rate with smaller tiers of influencers as opposed to celebrities. And of course, from a cost perspective as well, if you're very famous and you're a celebrity, it's more likely that you're going to charge more for a collaboration as well. So there isn't a right or wrong. The full art here is to find the right balance between reach and authenticity, and obviously based on the client's objective and what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I really like this. I mean, when we think about the data and some of the data points, Arthur, that I've seen in the campaigns, with the understanding that there are different kinds of influencers that are better suited for different sorts of objectives. The question that then both of us were thinking about, how is it that we can set up a frame of thinking for integrating everything into like a simple, probably not simplistic, but rather simplified way of approaching, how is it that we balance the different sorts of influencer strategies. And we came up with this hopefully very nifty sort of acronym, which is the optic of our influencer strategy. And under O, of course, is objectives, which as with any marketer, what it is and what does it mean for our campaign, what is it that we're trying to do. But also very importantly, the purpose of influencers in the system under P. So at MediaCom, it is, I think we always talk about, planning as a system, which is that we need to be thinking about influencers also within the larger space of the entire ecosystem of our media experience and also our media plan. So I think some of the questions speak to this, and we'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by the purpose of influencers in the system and how that affects our strategies. Time of year is also really important. In just a little bit, we'll talk about the perspective on how is it that we can use different sorts of influencers and the right strategies to play up on some seasonality factors, plus always on as sort of like the other end of the spectrum. In I, we have the influence of the brand. So today, what the current equity the brand has in the market and among our audiences is something that we would also want to make sure we consider in that kind of strategy and balance. And finally, for C, as Josh had spoken about, and really this is one of like the biggest engines, I think, that is pushing the growth of influencers as a strategy. What is the commerce, particularly the E and social outcomes that we want to obtain in the campaign, and how is it that we can maximize the use of influencers and creators for that purpose. So if we break it down a little bit more, sorry, Arthur, go for it.
No. I was just saying that it's a very simplistic way of summarizing some of the consideration when a brand or an advertiser is thinking of collaborating with influencers, is to make sure that they take all those components into consideration.
Absolutely. This is by no means, I think, exhaustive sort of a list, but hopefully it's quite a good starting point for all of us trying to frame our strategies for next year and even in Q4.
Yeah, and I think I just want to finish on the commerce one, and we'll have additional example, is we've definitely seen a shift of perception of influencers has been mainly used for upper funnel strategies, such as driving awareness and interest. And what we've seen, especially over the last 2 years, is using influencers and content generated by those to drive purchase and loyalty as well. So today, when we collaborate with influencers, it's you have to see it around the whole marketing funnels between awareness, interest, purchase, and loyalty. And we're going to see a bit more later how that could play out.
So how does Optic guide some of the ways that we think about? So as quite like a really quick recap, right? If we have celebrities on the left side and our nano and micro influencers on the right side, and just a quick rehash that celebs are definitely better for reach, but we do see that nano and micro influencers are really good when it comes to engagement and some of the advocacy. Then very naturally, when we think about the objectives or the desired outcomes of our campaign, we will then consider that when we have a reach objectives that we want to prioritize the ability to use celebrities or bigger influencers with bigger following because it helps to serve that purpose. However, on the other end of the spectrum, as we move through sort of like the spectrum of influencers, we also want to think about how we can engage with some of these nano and micro influencers that are really good for driving the engagement among the community and driving the advocacy. So as Arthur had mentioned, it is absolutely a full funnel kind of strategy that we can adopt, and different tiers of influencers can help us to unlock that purpose. When it comes to purpose, of the influencers, it's a very similar way of thinking. But I think very importantly also, as strategists, we try to make sure that we are very clear on what the role of influencers are within the bigger system of the entire campaign that we're planning. Certainly, we would always have the typical creative assets that we would be producing, but against the traditional paid media experience that we're creating, where does the influencer fit against that bigger strategy? And how can we use the influencers to the best fit for purpose against the bigger system campaign? The third point is all about, the influence of the brand. Or today, what we see the equity of the brand is in the market. So typically, we find that if the brand is a fairly well-established brand, then it works really nicely for us to consider some of the bigger influencers. But on the other end, if we think that, the brand is a fairly recently established brand, or perhaps the product that we're trying to promote is relatively new, then it helps us because we see smaller influencers being a little bit more authentic and credible to build a bit of that, the brand credibility and that word of mouth, so to speak, in the market when we're doing the planning process. And time of year is also like a really interesting sort of perspective that we've added to this framework, which is that, obviously, if you are like me and enjoy shopping, flash sales are just, a really, really great time of the year for all of us. And it's also become, such an important time of year for a lot of our advertisers and influencer strategies. What we do see is that given, the kind of reach, the scale, and also the cost of larger influencers, it merits that we think about, major dates like the flash sales, as well as specific launches, for example, for campaigns or for products to be reserved for the larger influencers. On the other end, where we want to build more of an always-on sort of layer, then working with some of the nano influencers will help us to build that scale, that in-community reach with each of these nano influencers and the respective communities. And finally, when we think about the desired and social commerce outcomes in the final point, it's that we've seen that, for larger influencers, the way that we can work with them or think about working with them is in a more strategic manner, right? So for example, under Real Magic, working with influencers right from the beginning of creating the campaign and featuring them in the campaign, it works really nicely because of what they're able to lend to us. Whereas on the other end, we see that, the nano and the micro influencers are really good at allowing us to have a very strong tactical push. So anything that is a little bit more promos related feels like a better fit for us. So that's kind of how optics can guide a little bit of how we think about navigating between the different tiers of influencer strategy.
Yeah, and if I just may add on the different usage or the purpose of the influencers, what we usually see is, collaborating with influencers for them to create inspirational content and, empowering the value of the brand. So, for those, maybe you will use probably more celebrities or bigger tiers of influencers. But then you want also influencers providing supportive content, descripting the benefits of a product or of a solutions. So you want that someone who will be sharing personal experience of usage of that product, and you want that authenticity as well. And what we've seen more about, as you mentioned about the commerce and the promotion is having those purchase triggers mechanism part of the content itself. And of course, we can think of loyalty, about how influencers can help brands building, but also nurturing the community and bring loyalty as well. And what brands are doing as well is kind of like having a set or a pool of influencers that, they kind of like pre-vet, they pre-approve, and they pre-engage with them, and they can tap into those resources throughout the year if they want to work on an always-on strategy. And maybe they will work with some brand ambassadors or collaboration with celebrities, for a big push or a big product launch, or to just drive the reach. But the reality often is in between those two, and as I said earlier, is finding the right balance between reach and authenticity. And often what we see is we use influencers throughout the entire marketing funnel. I just wanted to kind of like show one of the great case study that we have for one of the pharmaceutical brands, in this case in Indonesia. And it was a great objective where we collaborated with this brand. And one of the main objectives was to reach relevant women audiences to discuss about osteoporosis effect. And obviously how this specific product from the brand could support and prevent the bone mass, and how it can help women to build more strength in that space. The solution was obviously, first of all, you have to drive awareness of the new product. The brand itself is well established, but the product is a kind of like a new solution. And we wanted to help and support the brand engage with the targeted audience around that specific condition. And then, of course, was working with different influencers, different tiers about, driving engagement, people sharing personal experiences and what it is to live today with osteoporosis, and how consuming this specific product helped them on their day-to-day. And last but not least, it was obviously to drive trials and, sell those products. So we were also working with one of the marketplace, in this case, Shopee, around one of the time of the year about the festival. And how we supported that was obviously having some celebrities doing live streaming on the day, on the platform, on the marketplace, and supporting this event with pre-event and post-event media tactics. First of all, pre-event to drive traffic to the marketplace on the day, and post-event was kind of like a content distribution and leveraging nano and micro influencers to talk about the product and distributing the product as well. And these specific campaigns, we were able to work with over 438 content creators within different tiers. So you can imagine the logistic behind it and the length of the campaigns and the different objectives that we were able to achieve. Over 650 pieces of content were created. And of course, the main objective here on the sales path was to drive clicks to the Shopee cart, so on that specific product. The videos and the multiple content generated over 14 million views. And what is most important as well is, compared to clients' benchmark on different social campaigns and different channels within digital, we were able to deliver 50% cost per view savings as well with this mix of influencers. So the sky is the limit in the way we want to collaborate with influencers. And, this is just one of the example where we kind of like did the full end-to-end between strategy, ideation, content production, content distribution to maximize their ROAS, but obviously the live streaming and the sales as well. And we just want to finish with maybe a key takeaway slide. And Joyce, if you want to talk about the first point.
Absolutely. So what we see is that definitely the influencer landscape and scene is constantly evolving. I think there are even different ways to refer to an influencer these days. And there's so many different platforms that have come up where content can be created and is created. So I think one big area that we've seen is that how we can navigate a lot of these changes and evolution is to follow the data, as per how Arthur had also set up. When we're able to see the way that influencers are right for the brand, typically have performed or have worked with, say, other brands before that maybe we don't want to work similarly in the same lines of. All these help us to guide what the final strategy and selection of influencers should look like.
Yeah, and the data is important, even though it's a very creative business that we're in. Obviously, we value the creativity of the influencers, and the type of content, the original pieces of content they create. It's very important to follow the data and make sure that you collaborate with the right one. And this one is, often let's not limit ourselves to the tiers of influencers. There is no right or wrong with I want to collaborate with celebrities or macro, or I want to only collaborate with nano and micro. I think, as I said, it's kind of like finding the right balance and identifying what every single influencers and different tiers of influencers can bring on the table. It's very valuable for every single brand on that way.
Yeah, and a simple way to think about it is OPTIC as an acronym. So the objectives, the purpose of the influencers, the time of year, your current influence as a brand, and the commerce outcomes that you want to drive can help us to start to think about what the broader balance should look like in our influencer strategy.
And last but not least is kind of like bridging influencers marketing channel with the other digital and paid media or paid social strategies that you have. Influencers are known to create very engaging and very qualitative content. And what we're seeing more and more is the content distribution, about how we can take that piece of content created by the influencers and use that outside of the social media, outside of the influencers campaign. It could be on the client website, it could be on out of home, it could be on paid media such as display and video. And all that, when we see that, when we distribute the content intelligently, we overall maximize the return on ad spend from a client. And another trend is obviously making this content shoppable, or the ability to make it shoppable whenever is relevant, because we're definitely seeing a shift of every single client and in multiple categories wanting to drive more performance and more purchase or trials in this space. Josh, up to you. That was the final slide.
Awesome. That was really good. It was really clear. I was going to ask a few questions, but we're almost out of time. I think you guys covered it off anyway. A couple of things that I took out of it that I suppose were part of the questions, but things that you touched on anyway. Influencer needs to be part of the conversation much earlier than probably what it has been in the past. In the past, maybe it's been an add-on to a campaign. We've got a little bit of budget left over and we'll just tack it on to the end. Or it was a very executional element of something that we'd been doing. I think for me, with OPTIC as a framework, gives a really clear guideline of how to include it into conversations earlier on, how we can use data much earlier on in the conversation around consumers and how they're interacting with influencers will help us out creatively in the way that we communicate. And then finally, Arthur, you made the point around maybe not just thinking about this in a silo, starting to think about how influencers play a role in the broader communications mix, but how when we plan for media as well, that we should include that in the thinking. We're planning TV, over the top and digital video together, but now we've got a new part of that channel that is an audio visual element that we should start thinking about within there as well. So time's up, but thank you both for joining today. That was really good. We've got another acronym to take away, but very good. Thanks for everyone for joining Looplive, and we'll be back in another couple of weeks to talk a little bit about e-commerce coming into retail season. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.